Last week, I visited Prince Philip Hospital here in West Wales. My role as service delivery manager does not ordinarily entail seeing patients in a hospital setting. So this had been the first time I had been present on a ward in a long time. And honestly, I feel guilty to admit to you that I had forgotten what it was like to see patients in that hospital setting. This led me to reflect on how a huge part of my role in management involves dealing with numbers, data, statistics, numbers of patients on a waiting list, numbers of patients waiting too long on a waiting list. Numbers. As I travelled home in the car after my visit, it really hit home that I can sometimes become so embroiled in the day-to-day business operations of my role that on occasion I am blinded to the fact that behind each waiting list figure, each theatre slot, the data I deal with on a daily basis is a person, a human being, with a life, a family, job, a hobby, a story. So whilst I've been fortunate to have very good health, I have been on the receiving end of care as a patient myself. We will all have a clear memory of those early weeks of the COVID pandemic. An incredibly surreal time, I'm sure we can all agree. I am drawn to one memory in particular. I was outside in the garden with Steph, my boyfriend, and Ellie, my sister. The sun, unusually for the UK, was shining. We were having a glass of wine, enjoying the weather, waiting for our Easter Sunday roast to cook, asking that classic question, how long do we think this COVID malarkey will last then? In the days leading up to this, I had been busy in the Principality Stadium in Cardiff, working alongside a huge team of people who had come together to develop what became the Dragon's Heart Field Hospital. COVID was in its very early stages at the time. We knew very little about the effects of the virus, other than that it could be potentially dangerous to the elderly or the vulnerable suffering from medical conditions. So a couple of days after Easter Sunday, when I started feeling unwell and eventually tested positive for COVID, I had no reason to worry. I was young, fit and healthy and did not fall into that high-risk criteria. 4 weeks later, I was still feeling unwell, experiencing acute shortness of breath and pain in my chest and back. So I went to see the GP. Because of my recent positive COVID test, I was asked to attend a red zone GP practice, which had increased infection prevention control measures in place to reduce the risk of spreading the virus. Looking back, it was such a bizarre experience. Despite feeling really weak and fragile, I wasn't able to sit down, at the risk of contaminating the chairs. And during my consultation with the GP, had to stand at the very far end of a massive room with limited view of the GP's face for signs of reassurance. Following the GP's assessment, I was sent off to the hospital to have more tests, as it was suspected I may have a blood clot on my lungs. I vividly remember how scared I felt walking into A&E, leaving Steph behind at the door, as relatives weren't allowed in the hospital at the time. The eeriness of the waiting room, which was unusually quiet, the hard plastic chairs, which I was able to sit down on this time, with absolutely no idea what was ahead of me. I still feel emotional when I think of my sister and my boyfriend at home, my parents over 100 miles away. Each and every one of them must have been so worried. The wait to hear how I was getting on must have been extremely difficult for them all. We laugh about it now, but as a means of distraction, they were apparently busy cooking. baking a pie, brownies, a banana loaf, the classic lockdown bake. Gosh knows who they thought they were going to feed, given we weren't allowed guests in the house at the time. From the tests I had undertaken, doctors couldn't provide any known explanation for my symptoms. My chest x-ray was clear. My bloods, other than showing signs of infection, were clear. I remember Steph coming to collect me from the hospital, both in tears, the sleeve of my white top covered in blood from the cannulation, feeling temporary elation that nothing serious was wrong. But little did I know that this followed with 2 months of continued suffering from the same symptoms with no obvious explanation or light at the end of the tunnel. I was incredibly fortunate to have amazingly supportive clinical colleagues who continually checked in on my symptoms, recommending I purchase an oxygen SATS monitor to keep an eye on any indications my shortness of breath was entering dangerous territory. Those of you that know me will know I like my jewellery. Well, I tell you, that finger monitor wasn't half as glamorous, I'm telling you. After a couple of days of periodic monitoring, one colleague in particular was concerned at the results and supported me in obtaining an appointment with the respiratory specialist. I enjoy running, and I have run several half marathons in the past. Yet at the time, I wasn't able to walk up even a short flight of stairs without pausing to take extra breath. During the appointment, I was asked by this specialist to jog on the spot. My obvious breathlessness and lack of energy actually led her to joke whether indeed I had ever run a half marathon before, which I promised I had. Her smile and laughter quickly dissipated, and I vividly remember that look in her eyes, that look of, something is wrong here. This followed with me being sent for a number of further investigations, an echo, a CT, and asked to return home whilst they waited for the results. At this time, I was almost numb to any worry. So many months had passed by without an explanation for my symptoms. I had even started questioning whether I was making it all up. So receiving a call from the specialist asking me to quickly return to the hospital to discuss the results was a shock. I remember all the questions floating around in my head. What is she going to tell me? Having never had a hospital investigation in the past, I even questioned whether she was going to tell me I had cancer. It turned out that my CT had picked up a number of microclots on my lungs, which were so small they had not been picked up by my previous blood tests. This went some of the way to describing why I had been feeling the way I had for so long. Little did I, nor my family know, that those early days of acute leg pain, back pain, fatigue, would lead into months of uncertainty and almost a year of suffering. It transpired that I was likely suffering with long COVID. Me, a young, fit and healthy girl in her 20s. 2.9% of the UK population are said to have suffered from long COVID, which when quoted as a number, a statistic, does not in any way take into account the pain or suffering I experienced, the pain or suffering my family and friends experienced. I was one of the people behind that statistic. Doesn't that tell you how easy it is to become blinded by figures? Statistics, figures, patient data. They're an anonymous number on paper, yet sitting behind each and every one of those figures is a person. We often talk in the NHS about putting patients at the centre of everything that we do, centering our decision-making on what's best for the patient. But what does that mean? How do we, in particular individuals in non-patient-facing roles, remind ourselves of the patient, the person, the human being behind those figures that we deal with on a daily basis? Here are 3 things I pledge to live by. Get out there. Just as my experience visiting Prince Philip highlighted, there is nothing more powerful than visiting areas where patient care is delivered. So prioritise making time for yourself or your team to get out into clinical settings to remind yourself of the care that we deliver. Remind yourself of your purpose. Each and every one of us, whether we know it or not, will have a reason for choosing to work in the NHS. Mine, for example, stems from voluntary work on a stroke unit when I was in school, fuelled by my desire to help people. Yet when I'm knee-deep in spreadsheets or negotiating with the supplier on the price of loan equipment to keep the service running, given I am not seeing patients on a daily basis, as some of my clinical colleagues are, it's easy to forget the true purpose of my work. So drawing back on that passion that fuelled my desire to come and work in the NHS is, I believe, a useful grounding technique. Put yourself in others' shoes. At the end of the day, we are all human, with our own lives and our own story. How would we want our family and friends to be treated? How would we want to be treated ourselves? Both compelling questions to keep asking myself. Behind every statistic, every number, there is a patient, a person, a human being. And how powerful could it be if we reminded ourselves of this as we go about our daily roles? The capability of drawing on that humility is perfectly summarised by the noun sonder, which I am going to leave with you as a closing message today. Sonder. The profound feeling of realising that everyone, including strangers passing in the street, has a life as complex as one's own, which they are constantly living despite one's personal lack of awareness of it. Thank you.